Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about the Articles of Confederation, where we will learn all about the United States' first and failed set of laws. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to analyze the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and explain how those weaknesses led to the writing of the new federal Constitution. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. The Articles of Confederation were the first written set of laws for the United States from 1777 to 1789. A confederation is a form of government where the national government has little power and the local or state governments retain most power. Regulate means to make rules or laws about. Abraham Baldwin was one of Georgia's representatives to the Constitutional Convention and signer of the U.S. Constitution. William Few was another of Georgia's representatives to the Constitutional Convention and signer of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitutional Convention was the meeting of founding fathers to revise the Articles of Confederation and ultimately to write the new U.S. Constitution. Ratify means to approve. The Three-Fifths Compromise was the plan that counted enslaved persons as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of counting population for representation in Congress. The Great Compromise was the plan that created the bicameral legislature of the House and Senate. The United States declared its independence in 1776 with, appropriately, the Declaration of Independence. George Washington, our first president, took office in 1789 for his first term. That leaves 13 years in between before Washington became president. What happened? The Revolutionary War had already begun, and the Continental Congress was acting as a temporary government to prepare the Declaration when Chairman John Dickinson pointed out that if the United States were to be an independent country and throw off the British laws, they would need their own set of laws. The Articles of Confederation established a loose partnership of the 13 states, where each would retain its own sovereignty and work together in a couple areas, like war and international trade. A unicameral legislative branch was given limited power, including declaring war, coining money, establishing post offices, and sending government representatives called ambassadors to foreign nations. The Articles government could not demand taxation of the states to fund the government, including the funding of the military. The government could only request money from the states. Also, the government could not regulate trade between the states, which wasn't made any easier because each state had its own currency, which is confusing in trade. And also, there was no federal judicial branch to enforce federal laws. In the Continental Congress, each state got one vote no matter the state's population, and for the Articles to be changed, all 13 states had to agree in a unanimous vote. So what? How did the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation lead to a new Constitution? The Articles of Confederation were far too weak to successfully govern a fledgling country, especially with the continued threat of attack from European powers and American Indians. The founders wanted to get as far away from British rule as possible, and a strong executive ruler was, at least initially, the opposite of what they wanted. Sounded too much like a king to them. It was their plan to make a weak federal government, which ultimately was its own downfall. Let's take a look at some of the clear problems of the Articles themselves. Firstly was the inability to collect taxes to fund the government. Recall, one major jumpstart of the Revolution in the first place was unfair taxation by Great Britain. Do the Stamp Act and Boston Tea Party ring a bell? Their reasoning was very clear for making this rule. Why overthrow Britain just to face the same problems with our own government? Unfortunately, the reality was also that independence came at the cost of a Revolutionary War. And war means spending dollars on uniforms, guns, and bullets, not to mention paying the militiamen for their service. Money the new Continental Congress did not have to spend. The early U.S. militia was one of the most unfunded military organizations in history, and many soldiers deserted because of the poor conditions. Another problem of the Articles was that it did not create a federal judicial branch. No federal judges to enforce any federal laws the Congress were to create. So why even bother making laws in the first place, am I right? These problems were readily evident in the first couple years, as the Continental Congress struggled to do anything, but nothing could be done. The only possible way to save the Articles was to amend or change it. But the Articles also made amending almost impossible, because it required all 13 states to agree together at the same time to make a fix. This meant every state but one, like tiny Rhode Island, could agree, but the lone holdout was enough to prevent meaningful change from happening. The last problem of the Articles was also its biggest, and what nearly tore the country apart in its early days. The Confederacy created by the Articles was best described as a, quote, loose association of states, rather than a single unified country. People in those days, if they were to tell you where they were from, would say, I'm from Maryland, or I'm a Georgian, but never I'm an American. People would say the United States are, describing 13 states rather than one nation. Rivalries began to develop between the states, especially related to trading and tariffs. Big states began to complain that small states had equal power in the Continental Congress, when the big states had many times more people living in them. A change was needed desperately to save the country only 13 years in. So, I have another question. How was the U.S. Constitution developed? In 1787, these weaknesses were clear to many of the nation's most important leaders, including Hamilton, Madison, Washington, and Franklin. They planned the Constitutional Convention where representatives of all 13 states would discuss if they could salvage the Articles. Ultimately, the representatives determined to toss out the Articles and start from scratch. Learning from their own short history, a stronger federal government was created. The presidential system was devised with 3 separate branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. While the decision to scrap the Articles and develop the presidential system was straightforward, many of the issues that cropped up at the Constitutional Convention led to heavy debate, and compromises were needed to produce a document that all 13 states could ratify. One of the big complaints about the Articles from larger states like Virginia and New York was that tiny states like Delaware and Rhode Island had the same lawmaking power in the legislative branch under the one state, one vote policy of the Articles. Large states argued in the Virginia Plan that legislative representatives should be dealt out proportionally according to population. Conversely, small states argued that population-based representation would ignore the needs of rural states, and equal representation was proposed in the Connecticut Plan. A deal was struck, the Great Compromise, that invented the bicameral legislative branch, the House and the Senate, where one part would be determined by population, the House, and the other part would be 2 votes for every state, the Senate. The Founding Fathers agreed and all rejoiced. Another sticking point at the convention was on the issue of slavery. Several Founding Fathers wanted to do away with the practice. However, the Southern states, Georgia especially, would never have ratified a constitution that eliminated slavery. The Southern states argued that slaves should be counted as population to determine representatives in the new House of Representatives. More slaves would equal more votes. The Northern states argued that Southern states didn't believe that slaves were people, but property. So why should they be counted at all? You can imagine the argument. Would you count a chair as a person then? Despite the hypothetical arguments on both sides of the debate, another deal was reached, the 3/5 Compromise, which determined that each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person when counting the population. That's right, folks. The earliest text of the U.S. Constitution declared that slaves were only 60% human. The Founding Fathers didn't get everything right. The U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788, and all that was left was to elect the first president. War hero and president of the Constitutional Convention, George Washington, was the clear candidate, and Washington became the first democratically elected president on the continent, not to mention the only one so far to win unanimously. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? On the wall of pretty much every teacher's room in this country is the poster with the quote, "If you don't have time to do it right, you must have time to do it over again." The Articles of Confederation are the Founding Fathers' example of not doing it right the first time and doing it over again at the Constitutional Convention. The Articles were the big screw-up of the Founders. It was a rush job. They needed laws, so they threw something on paper and hoped it stuck. I mean, it is kind of understandable. They had just finished a huge project with the Declaration, and they were a little distracted by things going on outside of Congress, like a war. But the Founders could have stood to take some of the same advice that teachers give students every day when they're working on their big project. Take your time, ask for help, and talk it through with your group. Make sure you consider all the problems and find the right solution that doesn't create more problems later. That way you get it right the first time. Isn't that right, Benjamin Franklin? Wow, so learning about the Articles of Confederation is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? No military, no power to collect taxes, no power to regulate trade, requirement of unanimous decision to make amendments. The list above could be used to explain which of the following. Which of these statements about the Articles of Confederation is true? Which of the following describes what the Great Compromise was about? Which compromise between northern and southern states resolved the issue of counting slaves towards population? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about the Articles of Confederation. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff, but do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now.